So I just pushed up v3-7. So if you are following along, that's where we are. And we are now going to fix all of our linting errors. And hopefully from here on out, I won't make you ignore lint errors anymore. Believe me, it pains my soul to see like the red outline on there. I just can't, I can't even. So I'm going to help you also be able to not even. So what's going on here is there is a package that used to be included with React in and of itself called proptypes. As of 15.5, they are no longer packaged with React. This is an effort to kind of trim down the internal library of what React includes and doesn't include. It still isn't quite a clean break because there are certain parts of React that still rely on proptypes if you want to be able to use them. So that's an ongoing effort. But they stripped out proptypes, and they also stripped out something called create class, which we are not using at all today because it's been deprecated. And they stripped out a couple other things. So I'm going to show you first how to use proptypes because it is useful for you to know. Eventually we're going to get to using flow. And once we get to using flow, that kind of supersedes our need for proptypes. But I would say that using proptypes is more popular than using flow, so it's useful for you to have that knowledge, and then we can get rid of them. So I want you to go and say import shape and string from prop-types. So prop-types is the actual library that used to be included with React in and of itself. And only, a month or two ago was it stripped out. Okay. Then we're going to do underneath here, underneath show card, we're going to say show card dot proptypes. And I guess I should say proptypes are by no means required. Like notice this is a linting error, right? And our app still builds, it still runs just fine. What proptypes are going to do is kind of a twofold thing for you. First of all, it's going to be a runtime check for you to see if you're including the right properties into show card. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say show shape, and then we're going to identify all the different properties that we expect to be on show. So we expect there to be a poster. That's going to be string.isRequired. We're going to do title, which is also going to be a string.isRequired. Then we're going to do year, which is a string as well, and that's going to be required. And description, which is going to be a string.isRequired, as well as the show itself is required. No more linting errors, right? So they all went away. So let's talk about what actually proptypes are. So we did shape, right? Shape just means object, right? And I totally could just do, I think this works. So I could do shape like that. Yep. Okay. So we could do this, right? And you could just say it's going to be an object. And you would do this if you had a case of like it was an object and you didn't know what it was going to look like coming in. However, we know what it's going to look like. And so we're also going to identify the things that are inside of shape, right? So we're going to identify poster, title, year, and description. If you do not put an is required, then as you might imagine, it's optional, right? So it doesn't mean, it means that it's not going to send you an error saying, hey, you forgot this. I kind of wish that they had done is required as being the default and then is optional, because usually things are required. Also, according to the Airbnb config, if it's optional, you have to give it a default prop. So, and you would do default props the same way. You would say like showcard.default props equals whatever you want them to be by default. Okay, So any questions? Oh, and then the other thing I wanted to say about prop types, these runtime checks are not incredibly useful. They're kind of useful in dev that it'll tell you in the console, like, hey, you forgot this, right? The real use for these is that it's documentation, right? Anyone that comes in and looks at this component is going to look instantly down at the prop types. It's like, oh, okay, it's going to take in a show, and it's going to have poster, title, year, and description. It's just like a summary of what the API for that particular component is. That is, I'm going to say 95% of the use case. Because again, runtime checks, by the time it's in runtime, it's either broken and you know it or not, right? Sometimes it'll be useful as like, oh, I didn't know it wasn't including that. Like, what happens if I say foo, and it's a string that's required, right? So now if I go into here and I refresh, yeah, ignore the show.foo thing. We'll worry about that later. Or maybe let's do it this way. Refresh again. Okay, so right here, this is what I'm talking about. It's going to say, hey, you said foo was required. Oh, no, ignore that too. It should tell you, it should give you an error saying, I wonder if it's just being covered up by ESLint. But in any case, it should send you an error into the console saying like, hey, this is not there, and it should be there. So that's kind of the point. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of default prop types?
Yeah, we'll see if I can remember off the top of my head. I think it just looks like this. And we'll be using them later for sure. And let's just like put it out here for fun. So default props, I think that's what it should be. Yeah. So you can see right there, it's rendering out stuff right there, right? So it's just saying like, hey, if you don't pass in these props, this is the default prop type. So again, these are not technically required by React, but they are required by the Airbnb ESLint rules that we're using. Reason being is that it just eliminates a class of problem that you can have, right? Like how many times have you gone to say like props.show.description.to uppercase and it was a, you know, it was undefined instead of being a string, and so you got a runtime error. So it just eliminates that class of error. In other words, it's kind of annoying, but ultimately useful.